At that time, when I was a non-Muslim, most of the books that I was reading about Islam were actually by non-Muslims. And some of the things that they were claiming about the Prophet Muhammad is that most of the Bible, most of the Quran, what he was saying, he just stole from the Bible, stole from the Christians and the Jews that he knew, and so forth. And actually, the differences between the Quran and the Bible is another aspect that influenced me greatly. And I'll just like to highlight, for example, the issue of the nature of God. The Quran, one of the main aspects, in fact you can say virtually all of the Quran is about God. And if you think about God and His attributes and so forth, as the Quran explains them, you know, you get a very clear picture of who it is that you are worshiping. And you get a clear picture of the kind of excellence and greatness of this object of worship. And so when you read, for example, passages in the Old Testament and compare them to what you find in the Quran, you'll find that if the Prophet Muhammad was really stealing from the Bible, it is amazing that the Prophet Muhammad was very selective in his stealing of the Bible. For example, in the story of Adam and Eve, you'll find the story also in the Quran. You'll find that they were told not to eat from a tree. But the Quran does not say that it was the tree of knowledge. Did not say that God was afraid that humans, if they ate from that tree, would compete with God. But just said that they were forbidden to eat from a tree. And they ate from that tree. And then God came to them and spoke to them and taught them words of repentance, like what we find in the Bible. But you do not find, for example, God walking in the Garden of Eden looking for Adam, like you find in the Bible. Right? In Genesis, you find God walking in the garden and looking for Adam. Where are you? What's happened? You will not find these kinds of things in the Quran. The teachings about God in the Quran, as I said, will teach you about the real attributes of God. You will not find anything, for example, Jacob wrestling with God and Jacob defeating God in a wrestling match, or the kinds of things that one finds throughout, especially the Old Testament, Even with respect to the, or another important one in the Old Testament is God repenting of the evil that he was thinking of committing. That you find in Exodus 32:14. So your conception of God when you read the Quran, your conception of God actually turns out to be very different from the conception of God that you read, especially in the Old Testament. Even the description of the prophets, a lot of the stories that you find in the Old Testament, especially those degrading the prophets, accusing them of sodomy or incest, incest and so forth. Adultery was the word I was thinking of. Adultery and incest. You do not find any of these stories in the Quran. So that's why I said if people want to claim that the Prophet Muhammad was stealing from the Bible, it's amazing how this man in the middle of Arabia at that time, 1400 years ago, how he was so selective in his so-called theoretically stealing from the Bible. And in fact, in the story of Joseph, that story is found at length in the Quran. And there's one difference between the story of Joseph in the Quran and that in the Bible, and this has to do with maybe historical research that has been done more recently. But in the story of Yusuf in the Quran, you'll never find the ruler being referred to as the Pharaoh. Because the Pharaoh was a title for the rulers, that this term was not used during the time of Yusuf. In the stories related to Moses, there's talk about the Pharaoh. In the stories related to Yusuf, there's no mention of the Pharaoh. The ruler is called Al-Aziz, like the term used for the person of eminence. But in the Bible, again, when you read the story of Yusuf, you'll find this reference to the ruler during the time of Yusuf as being a Pharaoh. So these were some of the things that struck me. And then getting into the teachings of the Quran, the comprehensiveness of the Quran, how it touches upon so many different aspects of life, the timelessness of its teachings. Many people, many Christians, for example, many Jews, many people of other faiths, they have given up when it comes to the detailed practice of their religion. Many of them have given up some of the teachings of their faith. But if you look at the Quran, and you include also the example of the Prophet Muhammad, which is also a source of Islamic guidance, you see the practicality, you see the universality, and you see the eternalness of the teachings of the Quran. Look around you today, 1400 years later, after the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and you see people applying and being as devoted to the details and the laws of the Quran as they were 1400 years ago. And these people who are devoted to it and are applying it in this way, they are not Arabs necessarily. They are not living in Mecca in the desert or anything of that nature, but they are people from all over the world. And they find no difficulty practicing this religion and adhering to the teachings of this religion, even in the 21st century. People who grew up as Muslims and people who converted to Islam can take this book and apply it nowadays in a comprehensive and complete fashion, similar to how it was applied during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So the teachings are clear, the guidance is clear, they are practical. They are not, for example, like what are known as the hard sayings of Jesus, to turn the other cheek and these kind of things, which the Christian scholars in themselves, they have 3 or 4 theories about what did Jesus really mean by these things. Because they know that in reality they are not practical. So the scholars themselves have to discuss how are these supposed to be applied. But the teachings of the Quran, you can see or you can feel that they were meant for the guidance of mankind and will be so until the Day of Judgment.